My name is Sadiq Khan. I'm running to be the Mayor of London, and you're listening to Raw.
You're listening to Raw, 12:51 a.m. Bringing you your favourite shows 24/7.
You lot are locked into Tux Tuesdays.
You listen to the Daisy and Amy show.
This is living up the weekend at 1 o'clock.
Hear the best new music.
You and your love for Taylor Swift. No, don't. That's gone out on air now.
Stay informed with Raw News Update.
Certainly we're one of the few universities in the country who get to sit on the University Senate.
Some people have viewed this protest as a reaction to one person, which can seem like a bit of a witch hunt. What would you say to those people?
Keep the score with our daily sports analysis.
They have dug deep. They have equalised. Warwick 6, Coventry 6.
Discover the best on-campus talent.
This is the show where we bring on creative writing homegrown at Warwick.
Sitting on a bridge, looking at a broken edge at the gap, too far to jump and the drop too far below.
And follow us as we go outside the studio.
I'm Lauren and I'm sitting with the beautiful Foxes. How are you doing? I'm well, thank you. How are you?
If you've been asleep, you have so missed out.
You're listening to Raw, 12:51 a.m. This is your student radio station.
My name's Maryam Namazie and you're listening to Roar.
You are indeed listening to Raw, and you were listening to Perspectives this week on your student radio station. We have a massive panel, as per usual, on this show. There seems to be so many people on board. We have Barnaby Merrill, returning guest. Very nice to have you on, Barnaby.
Rejoice.
We have Ben Newsham, who is on the Politics Society exec. He is our academic officer. Hello, Ben. How are you?
Good afternoon. Thank you.
And Sophie Cowling, who is also on the Politics Society exec as our social secretary.
Hello.
How are you? And Mike Wrench, as I always introduce him, the former editor of Bore Comment. How are you, Mike?
I'm wonderful. It's nice to see a woman on the show.
Yes, it has been quite well dominated before that. And also, hello to Alistair Goldspink. How are you?
Great. I'm great to be here.
Fantastic. Now let's get on with the show and exactly what we'll be talking about this week. We will be touching on everything from Ed Miliband to the Tory election expenses. And if you have anything to say on these matters, please get in contact. You can message the Twitter page, which is at Raw 12:51 AM, or at Perspectives Raw. You can Facebook us by messaging the Perspectives radio page, or if you're listening online, click the contact tab, or finally email studio@radio.warwick.ac.uk if email's your thing. But now, Ed Miliband. Obviously, Ed Miliband, for anyone who doesn't know, listening to this politics show, was the former leader of the Labour Party and led them to a pretty disastrous election defeat in 2015, doing even worse than Gordon Brown did in 2010. And it's now been rumoured that Ed Miliband is apparently being considered by Jeremy Corbyn to be in his shadow cabinet. And whilst Corbyn hasn't specified what role he would give to Miliband, he said, when he was asked, Corbyn said, quote, "all that's for the future." So basically hinting that this might happen. And Ed Miliband has served in the shadow cabinet before he was leader. I think he was Secretary for Energy and Climate Change, and so has experience in that. Barnaby, as someone who is a member of the Labour Party and was a member when Ed Miliband was the leader, do you think appointing him to the shadow cabinet is right? I mean, he did, take Labour to their worst electoral defeat. Is it pretty desperate stuff from Labour now?
It's difficult. I mean, I think the reason Labour lost wasn't just because of Ed Miliband. There were lots of sort of issues with the policy, their sort of shrinking voter base. But I think bringing back a former leader, has worked very well for the Conservatives, you'd notice. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith, William Hague, all former leaders who've now served in sort of high cabinet office. And I think it can often sort of provide a sort of voice of sort of high-level experience, people who've had to weather a lot of pressure as sort of very high-profile candidates. And I think in a sort of shadow portfolio, that's what you need. You need someone who has the experience of going on the news and sort of talking about something.
OK, Alistair, you obviously don't come from the same viewpoint as Barnaby on Ed Miliband. I assume that you don't think he's one of perhaps the Labour big guns that they could wheel out effectively. Do you think the sort of concept of having Ed Miliband in such a prominent role again is toxic for the party that's already losing credibility?
I think Ed Miliband is a Labour big beast. Love him or hate him. And I actually quite like the guy, to be fair. I think Corbyn is obviously looking for sort of more, sources of support to kind of shore up his position in the leadership. Whether Ed Miliband is the right man for the job, in all honesty, I'm surprised that Miliband, wants to re-enter that world, having had, a turbulent 5 years as leader. So
so you'd question whether he wanted to go into frontline politics himself.
Yeah,
fair enough. Ben, as someone who is partial to the Labour Party again, do you think? Obviously, I assume you're a fan of Ed Miliband.
Absolutely.
Do you think he is the right person to return back to the shadow cabinet so quickly after that election defeat?
I think it certainly broadens Corbyn's appeal. He does realise that Miliband is more of a centre-left figure than certainly himself, and he wants to appeal to that core swing demographic that is the Miller fandom.
But do you think he'd be better off appointing someone who is perhaps similar ideologically to Miliband, but someone who isn't Miliband? Because I mean, do you just think the concept of this former leader just sort of shows if this is a Labour big gun, then crikey, what what else can they do to bolster their electability?
I don't even think that's what Corbyn's approach is. I think he sees it more as Miliband's just the right person for the job. Because if we look back to the leadership hustings, Corbyn did actually say he would like to have Miliband in the shadow cabinet.
He did, yeah.
So the fact that he's not entered now does suggest that it's Miliband's doing it, not Corbyn's.
Okay, and Mike Wrench, Ed Miliband, obviously quite a lot of points have been covered already, but what do you think about, just this overall thing, whether you like Ed Miliband's ideology or not, at the end of the day, he wasn't successful as Labour leader. What are your opinions on the matter?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's excellent news, but I think it's excellent news for the Lib Dems, not Labour. Ed Miliband is a bad politician in the end. He's just not a good speaker. He doesn't have the charisma necessary to win an election, and that's quite evident by the fact that, he lost a major election by a very vast amount. Basically, I just think that it's a good time to not be a Labour person at this point in time.
Very true.
And Sophie Cowling, what do you think about what Mike's just said? Do you think Ed Miliband's that disastrous?
He's got so much charisma. I completely disagree. I think the Miller selfie, the whole bacon bap thing.
He is big on Snapchat now, I'm told. He's been Snapchatting people on trains,
He's got
allegedly.
this massive media base that just Corbyn has not, well, I'd say yet got. He's got the support from young voters, which I'd say Corbyn also doesn't have. I think it's strategic from the point of view that he's sort of revamping the whole campaign, the whole Remain campaign, and he's just sort of brought in these new fresh faces and ideas, because it was getting a little bit, well, I'd say not forgotten about, but people were forgetting what they were saying, and it's been quite a long, drawn-out campaign, so I think this is just a way to revamp it and to bring in new ideas and new faces.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie. And on that... A new sort of feature I'm going to try on the show now is I'm now going to ask you, do you think Ed Miliband should return to the shadow cabinet? All those in favour say aye, but not now, and all those against say the contrary no. Okay.
Nay, actually.
Well, I believe it. Okay, we'll say nay then. All those in favour of Ed Miliband, or all those who think it would be a good idea returning to the shadow cabinet, say aye.
Aye.
All those against?
Nay.
Alistair.
Can I make a controversial statement?
Thank you very much. You can indeed, Barnaby.
I think Ed Miliband shouldn't have resigned as leader.
Wow.
I think he should have stayed on. I think he could have sort of slowly built up his profile away from the kind of sort of dorky weirdo that people thought he was. I mean, if you look at someone like Hugh Gaitskell, he got beaten by Harold Macmillan. Like, they had a 100-seat majority, and he probably would have won the election in 1964 if he hadn't died. So I think there is a lot of precedence for people coming back from sort of big defeats and so developing themselves.
Yeah, as a Lib Dem, I agree.
We don't appreciate drug references, Alistair. You should apologise to the listeners.
Well, it
at
depends.
home.
If it's a liberal policy, Alistair was adumbrating, then that's perfectly fine. Alistair, do you agree with Barnaby's contention there that Ed Miliband shouldn't have resigned as leader? Just to give everyone a bit of context, Ed Miliband got Labour in the region, I think, about 230 seats. 232 seats, which was pretty abysmal. But Alistair, do you think Ed Miliband should have carried on?
No, as much as I like him as a person, as a leader, he was just a continuing train wreck. And arguably worse than and less united as a party under Miliband than at times than they have been under Corbyn, which is a surprise because Corbyn is just the most divisive man in the Labour Party. But
I don't agree with that at all.
Right, unfortunately, I'm going to have to split you up there. Please take this outside, by all means. But we're now going to move on to some more Labour news. Apologies, they just can't stay out the media at the minute. And this is Jeremy Corbyn and the allegations, according to his chief spokesman, Seamus Milne. Thank you. The allegations are that Corbyn's Prime Minister's questions details have apparently been leaked. So that obviously every week when the leader of the opposition prepares for Prime Minister's questions to go up for this big battle against the Prime Minister, there has been someone within the party who has been leaking the details. Barnaby, do you think, firstly, this is possible, that there is someone on the inside leading the details, or do you think it's just more excuses?
Well, I think Corbyn's so useless at PMQs, it doesn't really matter if it gets leaked or not. And also, Seamus Milne is a paranoid nutcase, and I wouldn't.
Yeah, I second.
I wouldn't believe him if he told me that the sun rose in the east and set in the west. Quite honestly.
Fair enough. Ben, do you believe this rather, that Jeremy Corbyn's details to Prime Minister's questions, that there's actually someone on the inside willing to give the news to the Tories?
I have to say, I'm one of those people who do religiously watch Prime Minister's questions every week, and I don't see it myself.
Don't be ashamed, Ben. There's plenty of us.
Corbyn does have good weeks and bad weeks, but I don't think it's his details being leaked. I think Cameron is just exceptionally well prepared by his team.
I don't even think it's that, though. I just think the fact is that you can predict Prime Minister's questions really well. You just need to look at the BBC and go, look at what this says, look at what that says. It's just fairly simple.
Seamus said, I'll just give you some context, saying that this time, in regards to the last one, this time they did know the questions because it was leaked. It leaked from that meeting. He also said it's very annoying because it only happens about a third of the time, but it obviously gives them a little bit of extra time. And he says whenever there is a leak, it gives them an advantage and also gives them an advantage on TV as well. Sophie, do you? I'll just ask the same question. Do you think realistically that someone from Labour would be so opposed to Corbyn that they would be honestly giving the details to David Cameron, or do you agree with Mike that what's going to come up is pretty blooming obvious?
It is obvious, but I do think that there are people within his cabinet that are opposed to him. I suppose he is quite radical in his views, I'd say, compared to previous leaders. So people won't take him, as with a pinch of salt, basically. But yeah, I just find that strange. And if they are saying a third of the time, does that suggest that 2/3 of the time he's great?
Yeah.
Is that basically what they're saying? That 1 in 3 weeks is usually just rubbish. That's because it's been leaked.
Fair enough. And Alistair, do you think this is a serious allegation, or do you think it's more excuses?
It's probably the kind of thing that happens a lot in politics. But I would say, when you lead a parliamentary party that you are much more radical than, you're always going to have this problem. Corbyn is struggling really to find people to put in his cabinet that won't betray him straight away. They might betray him just a couple of years down the line. So, based on that, the hiring of Seamus Milne in the first place, in my opinion, was a completely mad decision anyway, because he is the definition of a left-wing nutcase.
Talking of left-wing nutcases, we're going to move on now to the BBC and allegations of whether they have been biased against Corbyn. On the contrary, and in case you haven't heard, this is the reaction the new BBC editor got today when she was asking Jeremy Corbyn a question.
Laura Kuenssberg from the BBC. Thank you very much. Mr Corbyn, you very clearly acknowledged this morning that immigration can put real pressure on public services and communities in this country.
The reaction in the studio to that was diabolical from someone, and people aren't very happy about that. Barnaby, Laura Kuenssberg is obviously, she has a tough job.
Yes.
She had a tough act to follow as well, replacing the infamous
Big Nicky.
Big Nicky. Do you think that whilst you might think she's done a good job or not, do you think she's been deliberately biased against Jeremy Corbyn?
No. There's lots to criticise Jeremy Corbyn about, and she does it. That's her job.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this element of the left is so childish and self-entitled, they're willing to blame everything on a conspiracy, even when it's actually their fault.
So you think?
Simple as.
So you think that what she's being accused of is literally her just saying what is in the news and doing her job properly?
Oh yeah, it's complete nonsense.
Alistair, do you agree that it's complete nonsense?
Yeah,
because you seem pretty outraged when that was played just now.
Well, it's disrespectful. I'm no fan of the BBC, but if they honestly think that it's some kind of conservative conspiracy, it's the return of the Flat Earth Society, isn't it? It's like the tinfoil hat brigade. They're back out in force again, and somehow have taken over like half of British politics, and I've sort of missed it.
Ben, as someone who might take a slightly different view, maybe not on Laura Kuenssberg, but on the BBC or the media rather in general, do you think there has been this sort of underlying bias against Corbyn, and that Laura Kuenssberg is perhaps, the straw that broke the camel's back?
I wouldn't say from Kuenssberg specifically, because something I read this morning actually is that when Seamus Milne first got his job, apparently he was overheard asking Kuenssberg for advice on what to actually do, and they had an hour-long conversation over how he should do his actual job. And
Didn't know that.
Do you want an interesting anecdote about Seamus Milne?
Go on then.
During Seamus Milne's time at The Guardian, He was considered to be a rather aloof and odd man. He would walk through the corridors, stride through the corridors, I should say, and expect people to move out of his way. And once a young staffer decided to, test this theory and got in his way and refused to move aside and made Milne move to one side so he could walk down the corridor first. And the guy apparently was so apoplectic he didn't speak for the best part of a week.
Really?
Yeah. He is an odd man.
Very odd. Sophie, do you think that the mainstream media has been biased against Jeremy Corbyn?
I don't think so. I mean, she's one out of how many opinioned
a load,
on BBC. I mean, you can't say the BBC in itself is biased. She might be, but I think that brings sort of the entertainment value in that case. I mean, the whole hissing thing, that's brought viewers, I suppose. So I guess it might be part of the strategic plan by the BBC. But yeah, overall, I wouldn't say they are.
Okay, just quickly, we've had a message in from Trainwreck who says, Ed gave us a bad name. Thank you very much for that. That was obviously on our previous topic of Ed Miliband, or perhaps an inside joke that I'm not clued up on. Yeah, thank you for messaging in. And Mike, do you think, as someone who works for a student media organisation, have you been deliberately biased against Jeremy Corbyn, or indeed has the BBC?
So the thing is, the defence of a bad politician straight away from student politics upwards is, oh, well, the media must be biased against me. And it's complete nonsense. The BBC is actually a relatively impartial sort of organisation, and these sort of allegations are pathetic, and they show the strength of the politics behind them, frankly.
And what do you think about those Labour supporters who did deliberately boo and hiss her? Do you think that's childish, or what you're thinking?
That they're idiots and that they should probably leave politics and go become preschool teachers or something, so they can deal with the children that they
preschool students, perhaps.
Yeah.
Strong words there from Mike.
My name is Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you are listening to Raw.
Can I make something clear to you? UKIP is not against immigration. We welcome immigration. We want immigration.
And on the subject of two Brexiters there, Nigel Farage and Jacob Rees-Mogg, we're going to move on to Brexit, and in particular this new plan they have for an Australian-style points system for immigration. Just before we touch on that, we've got a few messages in. Firstly, from Joe, who says, Jeremy Corbyn is the big nasty of politics. Thank you very much to that. I'm not sure in what respect, but thank you very much. And Big Nasty, the rapper, anyone who doesn't know. And a message in from Matt, who says, I don't understand why the rest of Labour dislikes Jeremy Corbyn. He just wants to socialise with them. So assume a reference to socialism there or something. And now, so move on to this Brexit conversation. We go pretty swiftly. So Michael Gove and Boris Johnson basically unveiled this plan for an Australian-style point system on immigration. Should Brexit go ahead, so this is their future plan. This plan was actually in the UKIP manifesto in 2015. And I just wanted to ask all of you, do you think that this particular plan for immigration is realistic? I mean, this is used in Australia. It's effectively one where they can sort of pick and choose who comes to the country, and based on skill primarily. Alistair, do you think that, firstly, this immigration policy is one that is actually achievable, and do you think it would actually benefit the UK having a Australian-style point system?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally quite a good idea, and I think it's workable. It helps that we're an island, but in reality, I think a lot of Western countries are going to be considering this, particularly if the Schengen Agreement essentially goes south, which I think it will after this summer if the predictive wave of migration happens. I would say, I think you've either got to have if you're going to have an immigration policy, you can have an open door, but what you can't have in conjunction with that is a welfare state or a minimum wage, because it kind of creates a permanent gradient, if you like, which means people will always want to move in because wages will always be higher in the country that they're moving to.
Ben, this idea of an Australian-style point system, obviously we don't know too much about how it would work in the UK, but do you think obviously UKIP get a lot of allegations about being so-called racist. Do you think this is a racist / discriminatory method that could be implemented in the UK?
Well, it would depend entirely on how it was implemented. I don't think it's entirely controversial to say that UKIP does perhaps play on the racist tones without saying them themselves, implying that this is going to be a more Commonwealth-centric approach, perhaps, which does seem to harken back to Empire a bit.
Sophie, do you think this particular immigration policy is, whilst you might not think it's desirable, do you think it's actually achievable?
Not really. In theory, it's great. I mean, it's the whole idea that, we're not going to be racist, we're not going to judge you on your nationality.
Yeah, exactly. Not going to discriminate against people that don't live in the EU. Yeah.
But it's based on skills, and I don't really know what that means. I mean, are they going to come in and you just sort of look at what they've got, and if we need it does seem a little bit divisive, and other aspects will come into it. It is politics. People will in the end look at race anyway, so I'm not sure if it will actually lead to less racist idea. I don't think it will be.
Okay, and Barnaby, what do you think about this proposal from the Leave campaign? Obviously, it shouldn't be one that's surprising, unsurprising rather. Yeah. What do you think about it?
I think the problem with the Australian-style point system is it doesn't actually work that well in Australia. There's an island off the coast of Australia in which rejected migrants are kept indefinitely in inhumane conditions and are often never actually returned to the country of origin. Until 1973, Australia didn't let people from non-white countries move there. And yeah, I think it's another thing. Yeah. The problem is in the UK is the reason we have immigration is because we have skills gaps in this country. Those skill gaps don't go away just by restricting how people can come over. It's a very long-term thing. You have to teach people in this country to have the skills they need. It's the same argument with homegrown quotas in football. You don't make something better by only letting people who are bad at things do it.
Mike, do you think this proposal, now it's come from Boris Johnson and Michael Gove rather than Nigel Farage and perhaps Paul Nuttall or Neil Hamilton, do you think, because it's come from sort of allegedly more moderate voices now, that it could be something that's achievable post-Brexit?
I mean, I suppose it's possible, and it seems like a good plan on paper, but like Barnaby was saying, it hasn't really worked that well in Australia. And to be fair, if you're going to compare an immigration system to a country like Australia, which is immensely racist, an incredibly racist country, then I think that's a problem in of itself.
Alistair?
I'd like to question my fellow
panelists.
My fellow panelists. I'd like to say, look, what is the appropriate number for the population of Britain that is sustainable? Is it 100 million? Because if it is 100 million, fine, because we can therefore sustain the current rate of immigration for about 20 years. If it's 40 million or 60 million, we've already gone too far. And if it's 70 million, if we don't cut immigration back to 20, 30,000 a year in the next 2 years, we're going to be hitting that by 2020. So I question how many people can Britain support.
I think it's important that there's an actual plan in place. I think that's what's the Brexiteers have done, is actually put an immigration plan in place, and that is going to give them a massive advantage when it comes to this European vote. Because if immigration is a massive issue when it comes to this vote, and when you doggedly ignore it, like it seems like the in campaigners are doing right now, then they're going to fail because of that, I think.
Alistair, if I could just come back on you there, as someone who, obviously I wouldn't like to predict your voting intentions, but you might have considered voting out in the EU, or you might have made up your mind already.
I am voting out.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. Do you think that the in campaign just don't have a plan on this? Because they cannot predict how many people will come to the UK.
Well,
it's unsustainable.
Essentially, it's putting immense amounts of pressure on Britain's infrastructure. Britain's infrastructure, as it stands, is designed for probably about 50 million people. It works, it's in something of a dysfunctional fashion because it's being asked to cater for 68 million people. So it's not surprising that we have problems with school place shortages or hospital bed shortages or road delays or train delays or whatever it might be, because it's trying to cram a lot more people than the system can handle into kind of an ever decreasing amount of space. Now we could invest huge amounts of money in building a lot more infrastructure, like 1 million new homes. Where the money from that's going to come from, A, I don't know, and B, really, do we want to just be carpeting over the countryside in the name of economic advancement? I'm not sure I'm on board with that one.
Barnaby was making some pretty ambiguous hand gestures during that. Have you got anything you'd like to say to Alistair?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think our infrastructure is good enough anyway without factoring in the immigration problem. And I do think there's a lot of space and a lot of places which do actually need immigration that aren't getting it. I think the problem is it's very focused towards the southeast. Places like Wales, Scotland, parts of the north actually do genuinely like Scotland's, like, please, as many immigrants as possible, just come, please, we'll give you free haggis. And so I think it's a dual issue of I agree with you on our infrastructure, but I think infrastructure investment it actually takes precedence over sort of trying to...
That's fine, but where is the money coming from for that infrastructure?
Well, the same way it comes from everything. We borrow it.
Okay, so we borrow it, which involves printing a lot of money, which has a strongly inflationary effect, whether it's hidden or not in the official figures.
National Investment Bank.
You want to talk about making poor people poorer. Inflation is a massive one, because if you don't own anything, if you don't own assets, that will always reduce the value of your labour, which is the only thing you have to sell. Whereas rich people who own houses and other expensive assets will just get richer by comparison.
I'm just going to pause that conversation for a minute there, just to let you know that you can get involved in the conversation today if you have anything on what Barnaby or Alistair or Mike or Sophie or Ben have said by tweeting us at Raw 1251 AM or at Perspectives Raw. Click the contact tab if you're listening online, or message the Facebook page, or alternatively email studio@radio.warwick.ac.uk. Just let you know, coming up on the show later, we have an interview with Maryam Namazie going to be played, who was obviously famously allegedly barred from the Students' Union here in that speech she was going to give to the Warwick Atheists, Secularists and Humanist Society event. Well, yeah, there was allegations as to whether she was barred or not, but we've got an interview with her when she was recently at another one of their events, this time on freedom of speech within universities. We'll also be talking about the Tory election expenses scandal, allegedly as it's been dubbed, and we'll also be talking about... we also have a quiz, rather, where we will be hinting on some of the perhaps more light-hearted things that have happened in the news this week. And we'll also have a very quick tribute to the late, great Charles Kennedy just before the end of the show. But now, on the subject of immigration, Sophie, can I just ask you, do you think that the whole EU debate, because bearing in mind we are talking about immigration in the context of the EU, do you think that the debate is too focused on immigration? Whether you do think it's a legitimate concern or not, do you think when we talk about the EU, we're just talking about immigration, and that's bad?
I feel Brexit is definitely, that is their central focus. Immigration is what they are basically fighting against, saying we do not... I mean, they're appealing to the... No, thanks. To the voters.
Polos are being passed around in the studio, just for some context. You wait, there'll be an EU tariff on that soon if you keep dishing them out. Carry on, Sophie.
Yeah, I feel like Brexit is just a focus on this on migration, whereas the In campaign have looked at all areas of the debate, basically. I mean, if you ask anyone on the street, they'll say migration is their biggest concern with Brexit in the EU, and that's completely understandable to me. But I mean, I don't feel like this plan that Brexit's come up with really is going to work in reality. I mean, if it hasn't worked for Australia, why is it going to work for us?
Mike was shaking his head there, Mike. Do you not think that the whole campaign's been too dominated on immigration?
I think it's completely and entirely been dominated by money so far. Both parties have been talking about how much money the other party's going to lose when it's going to leave. It's nothing to do with immigration. It's to do with how much you can scare the other side's supporters, essentially. And immigration is now being brought into it, I think, now rather than later, or particularly earlier. I just think so far money has been the biggest issue.
I'm sure that Boris Johnson's argument was basically just control our borders. That was all he was ever talking about. It was just, we have to find control of our borders.
Ben, do you think that this whole debate has been just a debate about immigration for some people?
For certain people, yes, but this is a controversial view for someone who's voting in, but I think the Remain side have underplayed immigration too much, in that the Remain view is much harder to sell than the Brexit view. Now, I think it's a better case. That's obviously an opinion. But it's a harder to understand, it's a harder to sell side of the argument. So they've tried to avoid the debate altogether, which I would say is a mistake.
Fair enough. And Barnaby, just lastly, do you think there's been too much focus on immigration?
I think the Leave campaign, for me, has focused too much on it, but also, the Remain campaign hasn't focused on it enough. But I also think it's been quite a very narrow debate. It's been the economy, it's been immigration. I think a lot of the left-wing progressive cases, both for leaving and staying, have been sort of undermined by the fact it's basically been Tory versus UKIP.
Talking of Tory versus Tory, here are two people that are in the party that we're talking about next.
What's the difference between you and David Cameron?
Well, I'm Mayor of London. He's Prime Minister. And what else? I'm older than him. I'm considerably heavier. What else? I beat him at tennis.
The
They met with a bunch of migrants in Calais. They said they could all come to Britain.
This is, of course, the Tory election expenses scandal, which has been in the news for quite some time now, but has only really been coming to light as they're focusing on individual constituencies. And one of those constituencies is South Thanet, it's been revealed today, where Nigel Farage famously stood. But on this general point, do you think that if these particular seats, many of which are Lib Dem Conservative marginals, many of which are Labour Conservative marginals, and obviously that one with UKIP, do you think if there was an election tomorrow, bearing in mind the Tories have had some stick on things like tax credits and whatnot, do you think Labour, Barnaby, would do better or even worse if there was an election in some of those seats?
If you want to sort of create in a laboratory the worst possible Labour leader to win Tory marginals, you would come out with someone not dissimilar to Jeremy Corbyn, I think. I think if we redid the election now, you'd have a couple more Lib Dem seats, the Tory majority would be very similar, perhaps slightly smaller, and you'd have Nigel Farage in the House of Commons, and the sort of left-wing fantasy, basically, that the Tories won through, like, you know, bribing all the counters, whatever it is they think they did, is, well, it's a fantasy.
Mike, what do you think about this? Do you think this would have honestly, if some by-elections do happen, do you think this will honestly alter some of the vote shares?
I think, first of all, it's bad. I always think electoral fraud is bad. But I also think it's just another excuse from a party that couldn't win an election, essentially. This is a party that used every excuse conceivable post-election to sort of say, this is the reason why we didn't win, including the voting system isn't fair, they didn't get enough votes, only 25% of people voted for Tory, which is more than voted for Tony Blair. It's just another excuse, essentially. And I as I said, I think it's bad. I think it should be investigated and people should possibly go to jail or whatever else is necessary. But it's just an excuse.
And Ben, what do you think about this particular issue?
Well, I don't think it's an excuse at all, because the police are investigating. They're investigating it as a potential crime. So possibly a crime has taken place. I do think that whatever happens, I think Labour will increase their share of the vote no matter what happens, just because anyone opposing the Tories in these seats they've won immediately has to say, well, they cheated to win. Do you want to vote for the party that cheated?
But did they?
Yeah,
if they cheat to win, I don't think the actual expenses problem is the reason the Tories won these seats. No. I think
that's the narrative.
I mean, if I could just,
yes, I understand. Yeah,
if I could just give some context on this, for instance, in South Thanet, the Channel 4 News and Daily Mail did a sort of investigation. How reliable that is another thing. But they found that a lot of the things were to do with the battle bus. And expenses to do with that, and particularly on spending returns, which were limited to 15 grand, and apparently Tory officials and activists had not been declared in terms of hotel rooms and whatnot. So this all does sound very petty, would you argue, Sophie, and not something that's gonna, not something that your average voter's gonna go, oh, you know what, he's getting a night in a hotel, I'm gonna vote for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour.
Yeah, no, I don't think it would. I agree. I think it's petty. The police investigation, I think it's just something they've got to do now that it's been brought into the media's attention, basically. I really don't think it's something that would change much if we had an election tomorrow. I think it is petty. It's hotel rooms, basically.
And Alistair, if I could go back to you on this as well, do you don't think at all that Labour would make any sort of impact in these Tory seats? Because obviously we're not condoning election fraud, but in terms of how people vote, it doesn't really make a difference, would you argue?
The election, if it was held tomorrow, would be a similar result to 2015. But the expenses scandal that seems to be emerging, it indicates something about the disappearance of grassroots conservatism. The Tory membership is now, I believe, under 100,000 at a local level, which means they're relying more and more on, firstly, expensive advertising and the postal campaigns, and secondly, kind of shipping activists off to marginal constituencies, which obviously is a high-cost way of doing politics, but it's kind of and it's not an organic way of doing politics, and so it's essentially going to result in problems like this, where they are going over spending limits.
Thank you very much, Alistair.
My name's Sophie Walker, and you're listening to Raw.
You are indeed. Welcome back to Perspectives. It is now time for the quiz that I know the panel are so looking forward to. This is basically where we are asked some pretty random questions about what has been happening in the politics news this week, and in teams they will decide exactly who they think said it or what was said. There's not an even number, unfortunately. We got 5, so one team of 3 and one team of 2. Am I right in saying that Mike and Alistair can cope in a team of 2 being disadvantaged? Are you both okay with that?
Do you just call the pair of them disadvantaged?
No, I'm saying they are, effectively, because they haven't got 3 members. Is that okay? So, on my right, we will have the Australian points-based system. So you just need to say...
I have no words.
You just need to say... points-based system as soon as you want to speak.
Okay.
And the team on my... There's an obvious reason, Mike. And the team on the left are... You have to say in Jeremy Corbyn's voice, I am electable. So maybe you can have... this is basically just to spite Barnaby.
What is Jeremy Corbyn's voice?
I don't know, actually. You can have Ben try and do an accent of that. But the first question is... Nigel Farage may have a chance to contest the South Thanet seat again, but who is the current MP there, the person who beat him effectively?
I am electable.
Okay, I'm questioning the Jeremy Corbyn accent first of all, but no, in all seriousness, Barnaby. Craig McKinley is correct, Amundu. Congratulations. 1 point to Jeremy Corbyn being electable. Thank you very much. Our second question is, which former Lib Dem MP released a book in the last few weeks called Coalition? Anyone got any ideas?
Points-based system.
Go on.
I'm going to say Ed Davey.
Ed Davey. It wasn't Ed Davey, unfortunately. I'll give it over to Jeremy Corbyn electable just to see if they can snatch.
David Laws?
David Laws is correct. Congratulations.
Because that would have been some pretty sexually assaulted stuff.
I played a nice bed under there now, just to get the viewers a bit happy. And my third question. As Ed Miliband is considered for a shadow cabinet position, can you name the other position he served in, which wasn't energy and climate change?
I am electable.
Barnaby.
He was... Lord, not Privy Seal, thingy of the Cabinet Office. Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster.
No, unfortunately not.
He was.
He did. Well, he might have been, but he had another.
Environment.
He had environment. He did have another position, but I might just torment you and wait till the end of the show for that. Another question.
I'm stating facts.
Thank you for that.
The wrong fact.
Question number 4.
Talking about the facts.
What did Boris Johnson auction off today?
What's it called?
Points-based system.
That is the one. It was a cow.
It was indeed
his dignity.
A cow. At this Brexit event.
Oh, that's a solid cow.
He auctioned a cow off. And my options for you were going to be a cow, a sheep, a lock of his hair, or his sweaty suit. So they were your possible options. Question number 5. When has Donald Trump announced he will be coming to the UK? I need a date.
I'm electable.
Go on, Jeremy Corbyn.
24th of June.
24th of June is correct. He has decided to come to open a resort in Scotland.
Oh, yeah, it's the golf place, isn't it?
Yes, another golf place. And he's coming, coincidentally, the day after the EU referendum. So tensions could be, very, very coincidental. Tensions can be very high when he comes. And also, the question number 6 is, which ex-British political leader is on the new £5 note?
Me. Whatever.
It's not you, unfortunately, Mike.
It's Winston Churchill.
Winston Churchill is correct. And finally, the final question is, a Libertarian candidate stripped naked at their convention after he dropped out of the race. What position was he running for?
I'm electable.
Barnaby Merrill.
Convention chair.
He was running for convention chair. Thank you very much for that, Barnaby.
Very liberal attitudes to nakedness.
Coming up now, we obviously have the Maryam Namazie interview a bit later, but someone who passed away a year ago yesterday was the late, great Charles Kennedy, and I've put together a very short 1.5 minute sort of compilation of his work.
Charles Kennedy is duly elected the leader of the Liberal Democrats.
I pledge to you today that I'm going to stand up above all else for social justice. We have to give voice to the disadvantaged and dispossessed, because those voices are not being heard by New Labour, that's for sure. The Liberal Democrats are nobody's poodles, but we're not Rottweilers either. We don't savage on command. That's the old politics. Every measure of public opinion does show that people are not persuaded as to the case for the course of action being followed. Now, why does the Prime Minister think that remains the situation?
Do you think all bankers should be locked up, Charles?
Go on, say yeah.
Just say yes.
On the one hand and on the other,
there should be handcuffs.
Well, we don't It's a bit stupid for David Cameron to suggest this. I mean, he hasn't got anywhere to put them for a start, and probably most of them were voting Tory in the first place, weren't they, Jeremy?
I don't know, I can't understand Scottish when it's like that. Can't. Most of them were what? Voting?
Tory.
Tory. No, don't understand.
Don't worry, Jeremy. Most people watching this in Scotland can't understand voting Tory either. So.
My name's Professor A.C. Grayling, and you're listening to Raw.
The former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Charles Kennedy there, who unfortunately died a year ago yesterday. Did we all enjoy that Jeremy Clarkson joke? Barnaby's nodding. And Barnaby, you have a shout-out, I believe.
I do. We have a listener from Florida, which is a friend of mine, Christian Nieves.
We have people listening in Florida. Oh, my goodness.
We also had a listener from Providence, Rhode Island a couple of weeks ago as well, which I think is just proof of my amazing brand.
We're living
but also, you're okay too, Henry.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for wasting your early afternoon on us, Chris.
Thanks for the endorsement.
Appreciate that.
And just to let you know, Matt Monk tagged me in an article saying former BBC Trust chairman Sir Michael Lyons says broadcaster is biased against Jeremy Corbyn in relation to the BBC. I didn't do a vote on that now, so all in favour who think that the BBC is biased against Jeremy Corbyn, say aye.
You're all correct.
All against?
No.
Nay.
There definitely people who didn't vote there. That's all right.
Abstain.
Yeah, and those abstaining.
Hey.
Ben, there we go. So on Charles Kennedy, unfortunately, he was a very good politician, but he wasn't elected back to the role of MP in Scotland in 2015. Barnaby, how do you think he will be remembered in the political world?
Well, arguably the most successful Lib Dem leader ever, depending on your view of Nick Clegg. He won the most seats ever. It was his sort of principled opposition to the Iraq War that really started to sort of destroy Tony Blair's popularity. And I think the fact that he never sort of held government office, even at the time when Gordon Brown was reaching out to the Lib Dems, is a real tragedy.
Do you think he would have had a pretty prominent role if he'd perhaps joined the Labour Party?
Arguably, yes. If the kind of SDP elements of the Lib Dems were still in Labour, I think he's Home Secretary in my sort of fantasy cabinet. So.
And Ben, can I ask your thoughts about Charles Kennedy?
He's certainly well remembered because he's part of that very select group, along with likes of Paddy Ashdown, possibly Tony Benn, where they like to cross the political spectrum. People might not necessarily agree with them, but people respect them as politicians.
Definitely. Sophie, do you have any memories of Charles Kennedy? Or what did you think of him as a politician?
I associate him with the Lib Dems.
Yeah.
I'm not a massive fan of the Lib Dems, I have to admit. But
okay.
for him, I
quite
really
hurtful.
Yeah, no offence. But yeah, I mean, considering that I didn't really like them, but I knew of him and I liked his policies, I think that's...
He's pretty on the left. And Mike, Charles Kennedy.
I think he was a fantastic politician, a good man, and a very principled politician, which is something that you rarely get.
And he had something that was quite unique, didn't he? I mean, whilst it's pretty popular now, he was constantly on pretty odd media outlets, regularly a guest on Have I Got News For You, as was evidenced there. Alistair, do you think he was different to your typical politician?
Yeah.
Did you get the appeal with him?
I could understand. He's not politically not my cup of tea, but he struck me as being a principled man and a good person. So I think it's fair enough.
Very much. So there we go. They are our tributes to Charles Kennedy from Perspectives on Raw. Unfortunately, that's all we got time for on the show this week. So we'll be playing the Maryam Namazie interview a bit later, but we will be back on Tuesday at 3:00, our normal slot. Apologies for this week where we couldn't make it as we were in an exam, all of those who do politics. We could have got Mike to host it, actually. Perhaps that we'll consider that for the future.
That's a bad idea.
Might increase our listenership.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and those in particular who messaged in. If you've got any stories throughout the week that you want to bring to our attention, please just tweet us at Perspectives Raw, and we might even give you a cheeky retweet, and we'll talk about it on the show next week. Thank you to Barnaby for being on the show.
It's all right.
Thank you to Ben and Sophie. Thank you to Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And thank you to Alistair.
Anytime.
Here is when I caught up with Maryam Namazie for Perspectives. I'm joined here now with Maryam Namazie, who is speaking at this event of free speech and censorship within universities for the Warwick Atheist, Secularists and Humanist Society, alongside Professor A.C. Grayling. I was just wondering, Maryam, what do you think are the main issues surrounding freedom of speech within universities at the minute?
I think the main issue is freedom of speech, freedom of expression. The fact is that it's a cornerstone of all rights. It's a hugely important right. It's, you can't fight for anything, for any changes in society, in the world, without the right to free expression. It's not an academic debate. It's one that is a matter of life and death for many people. It's not a luxury. It's not up for sale. I think that is the key issue, and anything that restricts it, that censors it, is something we need to challenge. That's not to say that it gives a free pass to bigots and fascists, of course not. If they have the right to speak, you have a duty to challenge them, to oppose them, to even protest. But censorship is not the way.
Right, so who do you think should, if anyone, be banned from speaking?
I think if there are groups that are inciting violence, real violence, speech that's offensive, it's not violence, it's not harmful. If they are actually inciting violence, well, there are laws against them and they need to be prosecuted. They shouldn't be allowed to speak. They should most likely be in jail or, having a court hearing rather than speaking at universities. But otherwise, even people we don't agree with, even Islamists who I don't like, even fascists who I don't like, let them speak and we will challenge them. The best way to get rid of bad ideas is to let them be heard and for people to also hear the opposing views.
And Maryam, how have you found coming back to Warwick? Obviously there was a lot of controversy before the last time you were meant to come. How have you found it this time?
Well, I've found this visit and the other one wonderful. I think there are some really great discussions and debates. I find it unfortunate that the student union doesn't see itself as a representative of all students, because all students are people like society at large. They're individuals who have different points of view, and it's important in order to represent all students, not just a small section of the students, that the student union needs to in fact ensure freedom of expression so that students can hear views that they might also like. Obviously the Atheist Society wanted to have me as a speaker, and it's important to allow and facilitate for that. My name is Maryam Namazie and you're listening to Roar.
Thank you very much. I'm George Galloway and you're listening to Raw. It's raw and it's fantastic.
Just a final note as well, that coming up on Monday, there is another politics question time event, and this is being hosted by the Pace Department at Warwick, and they have a couple of great speakers on, including Wyn Grant, the esteemed academic who also spoke at the Warwick Politics Society's event, and also Dave Nellist, who was the former MP for Coventry South West, I think it was called in those days, and is also plays a prominent role in the Socialist Party and TUSC, the trade union and socialist coalition, so it should be very well worth visiting.